My guest at this time is Ken Cuccinelli. He served as Attorney General in the Commonwealth of Virginia. He's now president of the Senate Conservatives Fund. We talked to him numerous times during the primary phase and leading up to the general election for the 2018 midterms, and some of the candidates he and the Senate Conservatives Fund were most excited about. In the end, it was a pretty good night for Republicans on the Senate side. They've expanded their majority. The only question now is by how much. Big wins in Indiana, North Dakota, Missouri, and it appears Florida. Came very close in Montana, but that did not happen. Fell short also in West Virginia, and we're still waiting on Arizona. Republicans also lost their only incumbent in Nevada. And Ken, thanks very much for being with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Well, the map was certainly favorable to Republicans heading into this cycle. You couldn't get one much better with 10 states won by President Trump having incumbent Democrats on the ballot. So, but getting four big flips from Florida and Missouri and Indiana and North Dakota, how pleased are you with what you saw last night?
On the Senate side, we are pleased. I don't want to say ecstatic. I was really hoping to see Rosendale hang on in Montana. And, with John James' late surge in Michigan, we hope that one would be more competitive. He did quite respectably. He got 46% of the vote, but which I think is the toughest race Stabenow has had in 20 years. And Morrissey kept Manchin below 50 in West Virginia. But all in all, we upgrade Tennessee from a Rand Deal Bob Corker to Marsha Blackburn, who we hope will be the most conservative woman in the history of the U.S. Senate. We see Josh Hawley go from Attorney General in Missouri, where he's been a tenacious defender of liberty, to the U.S. Senate, knocking out a true liberal in Claire McCaskill. And then Mike Braun, who is in the State House in Indiana, but he's also a businessman. This is a guy who went to Harvard Business, and instead of going to the New York firms, he came back to Indiana and started a business. So he's a self-made, successful businessman. Great to get him in there, real outsider. So those are some real conservative advances. And then you mentioned Rick Scott. And, boy, when your candidate is willing to put in $50 million of his own money, that's a real advantage. and that's what Rick Scott did. He is, he's kind of interesting from a conservative standpoint. He's really right in the middle, I think, of that caucus. He's certainly not on the left side, but he's not going to be a Cruz or Lee type person either. But he's a great pickup, and to have perhaps even bigger long term, to have Ron DeSantis win the governor's race there in Florida is huge. This is a Freedom Caucus member who President Trump got behind in one of the perennially most important states for presidential elections. And my friend, though not conservative, Mike DeWine in Ohio won that governor's race. Those two races have enormous consequences for the presidential election. And Ohio really stayed red except for Sherrod Brown and in the Senate race. So overall on the Senate side, we're happy. We picked up the Senate Conservatives Fund had supported 7 candidates, and 4 of the 7 won. And with the exception of Ted Cruz, who is an incumbent, obviously a very embattled incumbent, we always endorse challengers or open seats. And so we, by nature, we're taking on tougher races. And to win 4 of the 7 is really outstanding. In my 4 years at Senate Conservatives Fund, it is far and away the most candidates we've ever supported because we never drop our standards. We want pro-life, pro-marriage, pro-economic freedom, pro-liberty candidates. We don't pick between this issue and that. We want full-spectrum conservatives, and we don't lower our standards. And in this election cycle, there were so many good candidates that we couldn't actually get behind them all. In 2014 and 2016, I would say we were behind all of the candidates that met that description. But this was quite a cycle for high-quality conservative candidates, and we're just very pleased with how it all ended up. Could it have been better? Sure, it could have been better, but to pick up 3 seats to make Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski irrelevant for purposes of judge selection is a big, big deal. And we've made that caucus more conservative as well. Actually, both caucuses, House and Senate, get more conservative after last night.
Ken, you mentioned the outlook on judges is probably brighter because there's more margin for error for Republicans. The number that most folks are showing right now is 52, but they're pretty likely to pick up the Mississippi special, which is going to a runoff. And Martha McSally, of course, has the edge right now in Arizona, so it could get as high as 54. You mentioned judges, though. If you were to look at these four pickups, these four flips, obviously voters have many different issues that they come into the polls with, but how much of it can you attribute, do you think, to Brett Kavanaugh and everything that happened with that confirmation process?
No question. That was an epic turning point. I talked to Patrick Morrisey last night. Of course, he ran against Joe Manchin, the only Democrat to vote for Kavanaugh. It was sort of a hollow vote. He was hiding to see what Susan Collins would do and then voted for Kavanaugh when it didn't matter. But Patrick thinks that's what saved him. And it was that vote. And so, that Joe Manchin voted for Kavanaugh. Joe Donnelly voted against Kavanaugh. And I talked to Mike Braun before Election Day. He told me that he thought, it was hard to nail down exactly, but he thought the Kavanaugh swing was worth 5 points, which is extraordinary for one occurrence. And look, for a Senate that really did nothing legislatively other than the tax cuts, to have that issue that the conservative base thinks is the most important for the Senate, that being judge confirmation, pop in the explosive, radicalized, from a left perspective, radicalized way that it did 1 month before Election Day was a gift. It was a gift. Justice Anthony Kennedy did not give conservatives many gifts, but the timing of his retirement turned out to be one, and largely because of the Democrats, not because of Justice Kennedy or who President Trump picked. Brett Kavanaugh is a perfectly legitimate choice, fully qualified and eminently qualified. And the circus the left made out of that really riled up the Republican base, and it nearly equalized the enthusiasm gap between the two sides.
Obviously, the Democrats won the House, and they won it by several more seats than they needed to win the majority. So while the Republicans may have as many as 54 seats in the Senate, other than confirmations, what are you hopeful that can get accomplished with the Democrats now running the House?
Well, historically, in split government, you actually see lower spending. I'm not sure that will happen with a president talking about infrastructure, which is the biggest pork opportunity in the creation of government. But historically, that sort of counterparty situation has resulted in some level of restraint, actually, on the spending side. Unfortunately, what we will see a continuation that we saw from Paul Ryan, Kevin McCarthy, and Steve Scalise, and that's that the public funding of abortion was never undone. It was never fixed in the budgets while they were in leadership. And Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise want to stay in leadership after that incredible failure. Those are things where you might actually see the Senate fight. Because now they have a reason to. They have a counterparty in the Democrats in the House. So some things could become more favorable to us, oddly enough. But there's no question you're also going to see 2 years of contention, particularly between the House Democrats and the president. And that's probably helpful for the president's reelect. It will certainly make his next 2 years less pleasant. But the incoming White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, is a great guy, is going to be really busy with subpoenas and everything else. So, unfortunately, what we've seen out of elected Democrats is they're so responsive to their radical left base that you can expect to see a battle where they push for impeachment. You can expect to see some of the radicalized stuff, as much as some of the leaders might want to be more incremental to tee the party up to win back the White House in 2020. I don't think they're going to be able to restrain themselves.
You mentioned the Republican leadership in passing. There's a lot of discussion today about why folks think the Democrats won back the majority in the House. A lot of folks are talking about geography versus demography, or rural versus expanded liberal suburbs and even into the exurbs. But you clearly disagree. So explain what you really think happened here.
Yeah, look, no theory is perfect, but the closest theory to perfection is the one that those who fought for principles and priorities that they had campaigned on survived. They won. And a lot of those policy priorities matched up with the president and things the president had run on. So you saw kind of a political affinity there with the president. The people like, Barbara Comstock in my home state and Scott Taylor in southeastern Virginia, who ran away from the president and didn't run on national issues, and really hadn't done anything that they had campaigned on other than the tax cut. They were wiped out. The Republican caucus in the House got substantially more conservative last night. The people who were losing overwhelmingly, with maybe two exceptions, were from the left side of the caucus. They were establishment Republicans who unfortunately took Paul Ryan and Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise's advice to run these local campaigns. Republicans don't win localized campaigns. They win nationalized campaigns. You didn't see any Republican Senate candidates trying to run local races. They knew that every single one of their races was a national race, and they ran it that way on big themes, and that's why you saw such significant Senate pickups on the Republican side, and particularly by conservatives. And that was not universally true in the House. And so the outcomes were problematic. And look, it's a tough environment. It's always a tough environment in the midterm when your party has the presidency. But it didn't have to be as bad as it was last night. They didn't have to lose the majority. But the leadership's approach guaranteed the loss. And as we look to next week, when they're going to have a leadership election, the very definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Promoting Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise and expecting the House to operate, well, the Republicans in the House to operate differently and to perform better is ridiculous. It's insanity, the very definition of insanity. They need to go another direction. They need to stick with people who have proven they can lead, have proven they can win. Jim Jordan is the clear alternative here. The House Freedom Fund, which is set up by the House Freedom Caucus, which Jim was a founder of, they went 11 for 11 in open seat contests. 11 for 11 last night in open seat contests. Jim helped raise over $8 million for competitive races, some Freedom Caucus members, some not. And, he has proven his ability to help try to protect his colleagues from a campaigning standpoint. And he's also had success in organization and on policy leadership. And, fundamentally, the problem, I think, is that Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise don't believe these things they say. They don't actually believe in border security. They don't believe in budget restraint. They don't believe these things. They just tell people they do, but there's no evidence. They've had 8 years in leadership. 8 years. And what have they done? Nothing. Now you hear Kevin McCarthy talking about, I'm going to fund the wall. Well, where were you for 8 years? The best evidence that he's lying to us is that he hasn't done it when he had the ability to do it. He doesn't want to do that because he doesn't believe in it. And he shouldn't be leading us down the same path. We need to get off the path they're on in the House and onto a new path to principles, policies the grassroots get behind, and then victory again in 2020.
Last topic, just a minute or so left here. Ken, 9 years ago, you were a pretty happy guy. You had just won the Attorney General's position in Virginia by a wide margin. In fact, Republicans had swept the statewide offices. Now when you look at 2017 and 2018 in Virginia, the Democrats are making quite a bit of progress, it would seem. Tim Kaine won last night by 15 or 16 points. And last year, of course, Ralph Northam won the governor's office pretty easily. So is Virginia becoming a blue state, or is it more complicated than that based on the attitudes of some of the House members, like you mentioned, not embracing conservative principles, and possibly a fairly weak candidate, to put it mildly, as at the top of the ticket in the Senate race? Well,
look, Virginia didn't go from a plus 16 state, which is what I won by in 2009, to we'll take Ed Gillespie's governor race last year to a minus 9 state in 8 years. That didn't happen. Virginia is more susceptible to the winds blowing out of Washington. So I got a bonus running for Attorney General against the kind of policies that newly sworn-in President Barack Obama was advancing, and we were desperate for ways to stop them, particularly the illegal ones, whereas Ed Gillespie came in on the tail of Donald Trump, who has a special knack for firing up our opponents. And because he's so rough with how he goes about doing his business. I mean, America's very well off for him being president. We've seen the best economic growth in a decade, economic growth that President Obama and his advisors said wasn't possible anymore. Well, they were right. It wasn't possible with their socialist policies, but it's clearly possible. Donald Trump has made it happen. But his rough and tumble approach created a wind at the back of Ralph Northam against Gillespie. So, we are very susceptible to those winds out of Washington not only because we border it, but because 150,000 people in Northern Virginia get in their cars every day and go drive, and they are the government. That's who's going and working there, not to say anything about the Pentagon and others. And then we have all the Beltway bandits who service the government. There's a reason 6 of the 10 richest counties in America surround Washington, D.C. And until we're serious about shrinking the federal government, we're going to struggle with the limited government philosophy here in Virginia.
Ken, fascinating to discuss it all with you. Congratulations on the big wins and the success for the Senate Conservatives Fund, and we'll keep watching Arizona. Thanks very much for your time today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Greg. Always good to talk to you.
Thank you, sir. Ken Cuccinelli, former Attorney General in Virginia, now president of the Senate Conservatives Fund. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.